when I was in college, my father-in-law, who was tired of driving all the way out to the college to visit his daughter, who I had married, gave me a car for $1. Because we were using the same business secret that the Trump family did, and that is, if he sold me the car, he had to pay taxes on it. If he just gave me the car, I'd have had to pay gift taxes on it. But he sold it to me for $1, so the taxes were 6 cents.
Dude, that's dope.
Would any of that stuff?
Why can't we just do that?
And we never filed. We just kept the
why
car.
can't I just walk up to a dealership and be like, I will buy this car off
And
your
it was a
hands
19
for $1. You don't have to pay taxes.
It was 1966 Volvo.
Dude.
He had bought a 1972 Volvo, so
Oh.
I ended up with the 66 Volvo that it had something like 160,000 miles or something on it.
Not bad. That's pretty good.
It actually did great. It was built like a tank. I don't know if you ever saw those 66 Volvos. They were I ran into actually a few things, and it never hurt the car. It was just it was a
Dude, that's a sick vehicle.
Post.
I want one. Do you
Cool.
still have
Yeah.
it? Can I buy it off of you for $1?
No, I sold it for $150
Yeah.
You would.
after it was no longer running. Oh, the guy had to push it away, which was, and yet they paid me for it.
Paid you $150 to push
Well,
the
when'd you
car?
sell it?
That was when I bought the '72 Volvo, which Dad asked me for 1,500 for. So I actually had to pay something for that one.
Damn.
And he bought a '76, I guess, at the time, which turned out to be the crappiest Volvo he ever had. He didn't like it, and so after that he switched to a Maserati,
Oh, stepping up.
which he referred to as his spaghetti car.
Okay, why his spaghetti car?
Does that mean Italy?
Yes. Why would you buy an Italian car?
Ah.
So
They
like,
make good spaghetti, but boy,
isn't that all Dodges or Alfa Romeo? They're all owned by the same family, right? But,
and speaking of which, you can see how this ties into Hegel.
kind of the dialectic.
Anything ties into Hegel, so
Yeah.
there's got to be a way to tie this
The
into Hegel.
dialectic applies
Because
everywhere.
after all, when I kind of explained that, once I hit Hegel, my depression went away. I understood, hey, this explains everything. It doesn't explain secret keys to life and so on, but it explains why secret keys are developed and all that sort of thing. So it's the dialectical process. So the dialectic basically explains everything. By the way, the way the dialectic is kind of often explained. Do that. Let's see.
There's a really good YouTube video.
There's tons of this stuff. So I wouldn't normally put the agenda up there. I would just
They
start
always
with
make
this.
it political, so it's like hard to find a good.
It doesn't have to be at all.
No, I know.
It's
but like
it's basically the idea that you have a situation, and that situation automatically brings up its own conflict in some way, right? You could sit after mowing the lawn or something. You're tired. You come in. You sit in a comfortable chair. But after a while, that comfortable chair begins to be uncomfortable, right? And so it was a perfectly good situation, but just the way nature works in all respects is that a stasis doesn't remain static. Something comes up to conflict with it, and you have to move, or it has to resolve a conflict of some sort. And so it just uses the concept of the thesis as this is the situation at the moment. it automatically somehow pulls up its antithesis, right? And it doesn't have to be its opposite. So you might not say, it's a black and white issue. It could be gray, a completely gray sort of issue, where it's, the chair is comfortable, nice and relaxing, but it becomes uncomfortable. Is that that is the antithesis. That is almost black and white. But I don't want to give the impression that the antithesis is always just the opposite of the situation. And by the way, it doesn't always have to be actual. So it doesn't mean that I have to sit in the chair long enough for it to become uncomfortable, but I might decide, okay, well, I'm going to get up, right? So that's still.
Could you use like the Goldilocks story for a good example of it? Like, because she's constantly, it swings from too hot to too cold to just right.
That's an excellent example of it. But that's, a lot of people will point out taking it to that extreme muddies how this actually applies to every situation. So not every situation looks so black and white, but nonetheless, any movement whatsoever is essentially the result of the static situation changing because of a need to do it, right? So don't think it has to be so kind of, complete opposites, because that gives you a misunderstanding of the nature. What this is really is the Heraclitus way of explaining why change is constant.
Right.
Right. The situation doesn't stay the same.
So I'm thinking like a clock with a pendulum in it.
Yeah, but where Hegel comes up with quite a startling difference is to point it out that this is actually the basis of logic. Now, he teaches logic. In fact, he's this looks interesting. He teaches logic, and he points out that for thousands of years, no one has really messed with logic. Even Kant, in talking about logic, says, oh, this is boring, but you got to cover it. It hasn't changed in thousands of years. And by the way, when I teach logic, that's exactly what I do. So it still hasn't changed, although I do talk about Hegel in my logic classes. But the requirement is to get on to talk about Aristotelian syllogisms and then contemporary symbolic logic, and then we talk about some other things. But I do start the class always talking about how logic is bigger, is a bigger picture of things, thanks to Hegel, really. And so the idea is that the evolution process itself is the source of logic. So it starts off with being, everything exists, right? But in being there is the antithesis, the not, the nothingness, basically. And others will play on this that are Hegelians. So for example, Jean-Paul Sartre's book that we'll discuss being and nothingness. I don't know if I mentioned it already here, but that means being and nothingness. Being and nothingness. For Sartre, nothingness is the human characteristic that enables us to say no. But it's also a gap that enables us to say no, and the gap is the difference between the two sides of myself that we were talking about last class, and that is that in order for me to have self-consciousness, I have to have two of me that's having a fight inside my head. Shall I eat the candy bar or not? One side of me wants to eat the candy bar, the other side says no. You know, and the two of them literally are in conflict, right? So and then I will, out of that conflict, will be the synthesis. I will make a decision. Eat the candy bar, for sure. For me, anyway, right? And then, move on. Then feel depressed about eating. I'll first be happy that I ate the candy bar, then I'll be depressed that I ate the candy bar. And plus, we know biochemically that you have kind of about a 15-minute high from eating all that sugar, and then you have a drop in your blood pressure or blood sugar, right? And then you feel miserable, right? Your body is constantly going through this logical process that Hegel describes, but the very universe goes through this process for Hegel. So it starts off with everything, but out of that comes kind of this interaction with itself that creates the process of the universe unfolding. Right? Now, it's kind of interesting to think that wow, gee, he's talking about evolution, and in fact, that's the way I talk about it, because we use that word. He called it becoming, or at least in English, it's usually translated as becoming or unfolding. But notice evolution is really what that is. The interesting thing, though, is that Hegel doesn't discuss biological evolution, so that will wait until, of course, actually there's quite a few individuals involved in that, but the most famous of that, of course, is Darwin. Charles Darwin gives us kind of a biological evolution. By the way, that's still under conflict, and people are still talking about how that evolution works, and so on. If you're interested in evolution, I highly recommend Stephen Jay Gould. He is one of the philosophers in my list, and that's his book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. It's a little book of only about 1,200 pages. Isn't it? Let me see how many pages?
14.
Of course, 200 of those is actually, the
footnotes
and stuff. So the book itself is only 1,200. So that's why I refer to it as a little. But what's absolutely incredible about it is its description of all of the evolutionary stages of evolutionary theory, right? So evolutionary theory has evolved. And when you look at it, you realize,
that almost sounds like what the third man problem, right? Like your evolutionary theory is now evolving, so it falls into the category of things that are evolving.
well, I mean, if you accept this dialectical process or evolutionary theory, what you've got to be ready to accept is that everything goes through a process of evolution, even theory development. Right. Including evolutionary theory development, and so there it is recursive in that sense, right? Recursion, is the idea that we keep creating meta levels, right, until you're insane.
So there is kind of an infinite hierarchy then, because everything's building off its former.
The neat thing about it, though, is that you never quite get to the end of that infinite.
Right.
And when you talk about infinity, and that by itself, my favorite book. Is this bad to do to you guys? To just mention?
Is this bad?
No, this is
bad.
how I would do it at home. This is how I research stuff.
Is this bad?
Well,
all right.
So his book is Everything and More. Everything and More. That's a terrific book on the infinite and more.
Right.
There's the concept of infinity has evolved.
Right.
right? And it's also funny.
Sizes of employees.
So he starts it off basically talking about the subject and giving you kind of mathematical symbols that he invents himself, and abbreviations and things, which most of them are absolutely silly, but they accumulate, and eventually you have to actually know them in order to read further in the book.
All right.
So
It's kind of
so
it's awesome.
he's brilliant. And, well, he's also dead. Sorry. Well, he was funny.
If he's so smart,
Dude.
why is he dead?
He was funny. Why are all the funny ones
I'm
dead?
telling
You asked
man,
earlier.
It's all the fun ones. Hey, that's a good
It's
clue.
only recently they stopped being burned, right?
Pardon?
Stop.
It's only recently they stopped being.
Burned.
Intellectual people
Hmm.
in the 12th
At least he didn't get
and
frozen.
1600s.
Burn the witch.
You had to be careful what you said because the church would.
I'm thinking Wicked when you say that, though. You know Wicked.
The Broadway show.
Yes.
Why?
Because you said burn the witch. They're all trying to burn the witch.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we learned in Harry Potter that was always just a joke for the witches, because they could, just separate whenever they felt like it.
Yeah, they need to do like a sequel around where were they doing it here? Salem.
Oh.
Dude, it ties in, man.
Yeah?
Harry Potter universe.
Oh, well.
Harry's colonial cousin.
So when we think of Hegel's logic and the thesis, antithesis, keep in mind that this is just Hegel's, so it doesn't have to be political. You're right. You don't have to have these are just an example.
Well, it's just I see the majority of it whenever I look it up. It's always some crazy right-wing conspiracy site.
Doesn't have to be.
Most people talking about Hegel are like.
So I wouldn't put Fukuyama in that
No.
that group. This is. Sorry, I've been reading this so slowly. I'm still getting through this. But I thought as I was reading this today, this is an excellent example. This is page 92. So when we first encountered Themis, which is our pride, our self-worth, our identity, right? The value that we think of as ourselves. In Plato's Republic, it was not generally shared among all human beings. Rather, it was the exclusive province of the guardian or warrior class, individuals who deserved recognition because of their willingness to risk their lives in a violent struggle to defend the larger community. We saw that dignity became universalized in the Christian tradition because all human beings were held to be capable of moral choice, a capacity that in Protestant thought was said to reside deep inside each individual. This concept of universal dignity was then secularized in the form of rational moral rules by Kant. To this, Rousseau added the idea that the inner moral self was not just capable of binary moral choices, but was filled with a plenitude of feelings and personal experiences that were suppressed by the surrounding society. Access to those feelings rather than their suppression became the moral imperative. Dignity now centered on the recovery of the authentic inner being and society's recognition of the potential that resided in each of its members. A liberal society increasingly came to be understood not just as a political order that protected certain minimal individual rights, but rather as one that actively encouraged the full actualization of the inner self. In the Christian tradition, the inner self was the source of original sin, but was also the seat of moral choice by which sin could be overcome. Dignity rested on the ability of an individual believer to comply with a host of moral rules regarding sex, the family, relations with neighbors and rulers, at the expense of inner sinful desires. With the erosion of the shared moral horizon established by common religion in Western countries, it became less possible to award dignity only to those individuals who complied with Christianity's moral rules. Religion was instead seen as a form of idolatry or false consciousness. Recognition was due rather to the expressive inner self that might at times even want to transgress religious rules. The way these ideas played out in the 20th century American culture can be illustrated by the work of the California Task Force to promote self-esteem and personal social responsibility, which issued the report Toward a State of Self-Esteem in 1990. The task force was the brainchild of state legislator John Vasconcellos, however you say that, who was influenced by the human potential movement that flourished in the California Bay Area from the 1960s on. The latter built on the ideas of the psychologist Abraham Maslow, who became famous for his hierarchy of needs. At the bottom of the hierarchy were basic physiological needs like food and drink, in the middle were social needs like safety and security, and at the top was something Maslow labeled self-actualization. He argued that most people fail to realize the greater part of their potential. Self-esteem was critical to self-actualization, since individuals were held back by low estimates of their own capabilities. Consistent with the modern concept of identity was the idea that the individual's self-actualization was a higher need than the requirements of the broader society. Imagine that, right? The task force defined self-esteem in the following terms. Being alive as a human being has an innate importance, an importance to which the authors of the Declaration of Independence referred when they declared that all people are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. This conviction concerning the dignity of every human personality has long been part of our nation's moral and religious heritage. Every person has unique significance simply because the precious and mysterious gift of life as a human being has been given. This is an inherent value which no adversary or adversity can take away. The report noted, appreciating my own worth and importance does not depend on measuring the quantity or quality of my abilities against those of someone else. Every person's abilities are valuable and needed. Each of us has a contribution to make to our society, it elaborated. The point is not to become acceptable or worthy, but to acknowledge the worthiness that already exists. Our feelings are part of this, and accepting them builds our self-esteem. We each can celebrate our special race, ethnicity, and culture. We can appreciate our bodies, our gender, and our sexuality. We can accept our ideas, feelings, and creativity. In these few pages, we can see the expression of a long line of ideas that ultimately trace back to Rousseau, that each of us has an inner self buried deep within, that it is unique and a source of creativity, that the self residing in each individual has an equal value to that of others, that the self is expressed not through reason but through feelings, and finally that this inner self is the basis of the human dignity that is recognized in political documents such as the Declaration of Independence. It is, in short, a clear statement of the post-Rousseauian concept of identity. Do you see what he's doing here is describing this evolution of the concepts and its impact on the society through the development of these different kinds of attitudes expressed in different documents. And the California Task Force report embodies a huge internal contradiction. There's that antithesis, right? However, which in turn reflects the fundamental tension between isothemia, that's where we're all the same, right? And megalothemia, where I'm superior, I'm the Ubermensch, right? You're just a muggle. I'm, absolutely Scorpio Malfoy or whatever, right? It asserts that each individual has a creative and capable inner self. It strives to be non-judgmental, warning that we should not compare ourselves to others or allow ourselves to be judged by other people's standards. However, the authors of the report quickly confront the problem that the inner selves we are celebrating may be cruel, violent, narcissistic, or dishonest, or they may be simply lazy and shallow, like me. Right? Having affirmed the need for universal self-esteem, the report immediately states that self-esteem must also encompass social responsibility and respect for others, noting that crime is the direct outcome of the absence of such respect. It celebrates as a component of self-esteem integrity of character, which is composed of virtues such as honesty, compassion, discipline, industriousness, reverence, perseverance, devotion, forgiveness, kindness, courage, gratitude, and grace. But not everyone is virtuous in these ways, which means that some people are more worthy of respect than others. We would never esteem a rapist or murderer as we would an upstanding citizen. The view that self-esteem is based on an individual's ability to follow certain substantive social rules to possess virtues is a much more traditional understanding of human dignity. But since not everyone is virtuous, this understanding of esteem stands at odds with the report's desire to affirm everyone's intrinsic worth. Get it? So this is Hegelian. So, and by the way, he's not a Marxist, etc.
Well, Marx wasn't a Hegelian either, right? I mean, he just flipped it.
Well, yes, but that would be...
I mean, he was
I would certainly call him a Hegelian.
Right, I mean, he used the dialectic. But
he used Hegel, and it's basically his interpretation of what Hegel should have said.
Well, right, but I mean, to say Marx is Hegelian kind of makes it seem as if Hegel was Marxist.
No, it's not reciprocal that way.
Right, but I think that's...
Because Hegel was actually very pro the German state. Because he thought the German state was basically, because part of the logic is that the way the world evolves is the way it's supposed to evolve.
Towards some kind of German superstate.
It's the better argument wins.
Right.
And by the way, that's one of my favorite quotes from Habermas. Habermas argues that the unforced force of the better argument. Let me see if I can find this for you. Habermas. Unforced force. This is how democracy should work. We should all sit around and rationally argue out, or scientifically argue out things, and by all being reasonable, rational, the unforced force. So no one's got a bat and it's going to hit you over the head because you're not accepting what they say. Instead, we are all convinced by the rational data base with the argument that this is global warming, or not, right? And actually, when I said Fukuyama is not a Marxist, I would argue he's not, well, I mean, clearly is, but basically, as an academic, he takes a neutral, I'm not saying he's a Marxist,
No.
But he does have a position. He's a pragmatic capitalist Democrat, I would imagine, right? But the thing is, as an academic, he's basically the observer, taking the observer's stance and describing the way things happen. So he's not kind of coming in and saying, oh, if we want this to happen, this is what we got to do.
Right.
He does actually...
it's analytical, not prescriptive.
Right. He's because Fukuyama has a book, and it's...
oh, that guy. Okay, I forgot him.
Yeah, so the one I want, though, is State Building. I mean, his
So
concern.
he kind of is a German idealist then.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But now, my argument through the next couple of classes will be to say that so Hegel gives this whole picture, right? Evolution, stasis. Well, I shouldn't say stasis. The thesis. I'll go with that, right? Because stasis means you're trying to hold yourself in a static position, right? But it never stays that way. The stasis doesn't remain static for long. Something will conflict with it, and it will move on to something else. You can go a meta level and say that this process is stasis,
Sure.
right? So if I'm growing an oak tree in a nice place where it will actually grow instead of here, sorry.
You're not.
You've got, and that's a stasis in itself. That every time I say I'm sorry, she knows I'm not, right? But so we've got, this is the way an oak tree will grow, and you can say, okay, at 5 years it should be this tall, if it's had the right kind of conditions. I've got an apple tree on my front lawn. My son planted there years ago, and every winter the moose come and eat the top off of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still only this tall
Mm-hmm.
because the moose keep eating it. So that's a static situation. It keeps trying, but it's in an environment where the moose are not going to allow it to go any taller because it's a really tasty tree. It's probably the same moose that eats the top off of it every year because that's like his dessert, or something. What's odd, though, is just a few yards away from that tree, among some other trees that the moose never bothers with, is an apple tree that's now maybe about 30 foot tall. I can't get all they're just the little crab apples off of it. They're tasty, though. So it includes all of these different kinds of situations. The theory is a blanket explanation for change in general, right? But notice that that's an important change over the static view that you get associated with Sir Isaac Newton, Kant.
Well, how's it different from Aristotle's actuality and potentiality? Because it feels really similar.
Yeah. Well, we do think of Kant as kind of the German Plato,
Mm-hmm.
and Hegel as the German Aristotle.
Really?
Kant's Plato.
Okay.
So it is like Kant gives you kind of the ideal situation, although now it's been flipped because the ideal is actually based on our projection of our human moral values, which do come from God, but nonetheless they're centered on our depiction of it. It's not the way things are themselves, it's the way we make them look to us, right? But Hegel comes along and accepts that, except that he's dynamic. So instead of it being a static picture, instead it's an organic one. It's like the tree. The oak tree is the metaphor of his system. So at what point does the oak tree become an oak tree?
So he basically just gives Kant's noumenal world the ability to change?
It's really kind of exciting because it's in a way it's more powerful than that, because it also can be understood as doing away with the idea that the noumenal is outside the scope of our understanding. So for if
everything's phenomenal, so he combines the two.
Even the noumenal is phenomenal.
Got it.
For Hegel, right? Because how do you know? What are you talking about?
No.
It has evolved. Our conception of this that is beyond our ability to understand it has evolved, and that's part of our understanding. And for Kant to come along and say these things must be the case
Yeah.
is our ability to understand it. So,
Right.
so what Hegel's talking about is this evolution of our consciousness, our understanding of it, our culture, our concepts. Our concepts are evolving. They're becoming more complex. They're becoming more powerful as tools. We have a better understanding of the human nature.
We even have a better understanding of Kant's noumenal world.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. He's not destroying Kant. He doesn't come along and
No,
say
yeah.
Kant's wrong about this. He says Kant is right about this, but he didn't go far enough.
Got it.
If God is totally unknowable by us, then that's not the God that Christianity tells us we have to know. You've got to know God, because otherwise you're not saved. So of course, the noumenal characteristics of God are exactly what we know of God, right?
Right,
So,
right.
so we're not ignorant of God, and
God.
so you feel, like, I remember in W.T. Stace's book, he talks about, this German generation comes flags waving into the very absolute itself.
All right.
So Kant said, no, you can't go there, and the Germans, yes, liberty,
Got it.
because they did like the French. They built the Liberty, they planted a Liberty tree, which was an oak in Jena. No, wherever they were, I forget where him and his friends, they planted. And his friends, by the way, were Schelling and Herdeline. They were roommates in Tübingen, which you can go visit, by the way. And from what I understand, it's great if you go and live in Tübingen for a while, because your health will improve, because none of the buildings have elevators.
So Hegel
So
basically.
you have to do a lot of steps.
So Hegel doesn't do away with the noumenal; he does away with the phenomenal completely.
Well, the
right?
phenomenal includes everything. So when he talks about,
Because he's an idealist, right?
well, that's confusing, because in a sense, what?
Ideaist? I don't know.
Well, so
This doesn't talk about like Geist.
right. So in a way, remember a theme that I've tried to add to this, and it's not GRE material, because this is not what's considered correct by the tradition. But the tradition is all screwed up, because when the British look at Hegel's phenomenology, Bailey is the original translator of it, and the British interpret this as idealism. The trouble is, they think it's just wacko stuff. It doesn't seem to have any basis. It does lead to the contemporary view called the socially constructed reality. You're familiar with that? Socially constructed
Yeah.
reality?
So,
Also known as social construction. So this is actually the phenomenal world. It's the social construction of reality is our phenomena. Even the colors I see are, in a sense, socially constructed. So, I mean, we could talk about the British Prime Minister Gladstone, I think it was, that was also a Greek scholar and did his own translation of the Iliad and the Odyssey, or his own studies on them. One of the things that came out of that was he realized that in those poems, the Greeks only have three colors: red, black, and white. And he began wondering, well, did the Greeks not have the ability to see other colors? And our conclusion today is no, that's clearly because the evolution of our eyes had to take hundreds of thousands of years, whatever. But our cultural linguistic development can take a few years.
I think Korean doesn't have a word for green.
Well, I remember, I think it's Guy Deutscher, in his book.
But then, you could even argue that the colored clothes you're wearing were made by somebody. Somebody had to make the dye.
Language glass. So Guy Deutscher, Through the Language Glass. He talks about how the language you speak has that impact on your mind so that you see what your language allows you to see.
Mm-hmm.
Colors is one of the perfect examples of this, because colors are not really translatable from one language to another. Even something like Russian and English, they have different blues, so that when you're a Russian and you're speaking Russian, you see blues in a different way than Americans see blues in English. I mean, that's been at least studied to the point where they're convinced that that's really the case, right? So your language does have an effect on how your world appears to you, right? And of course, this is also where he talks about the British Prime Minister talking about the discovery that they only had these colors and the argument over, what does that mean, etc., right? And it could very well be that the Greeks didn't have the capability of identifying all the sorts of colors that we have today. And there's actually an argument over all of this, of course, because academics need a job, right?
Yeah, right.
And the one argument that I thought was pretty good, right, was that the Greeks were not actually talking about colors as we think of it, but as textures.
Mm.
So like the wine red sea, you're like, what? Seas are not red. But they glisten because they're fluid in the light. So they're not talking perhaps about the color red. That's in a sense maybe a mistranslation into English. It shouldn't be red. It should instead be the glistening sea or the glistening wine, rather than red wine.
Or it could just
red
be
sea.
could just have
But
needed
it's
a
also
line
red
there.
blood, right? So it's all fascinating, and no real solid answer. There's no way we could go back without a time machine, and probably then they'd just slice your head off. We won't find out.
I know, right? That's like everybody's like, oh yeah, I'd love to go back in time with like all my high-tech gear. And it's
Make
like,
sure
well,
you
then,
get your shots.
Well, but I mean, nobody wants to go get dropped off in the middle of Africa with all their high-tech gear. You'd be gone, man. They'd steal your stuff.
Well, don't take any diseases with you.
Oh yeah, then your grandfather never lives. And
Dude, I could do that, huh? I'd go back and get everybody sick.
Yeah. You can see yourself in a Polaroid snapshot. And you just start gradually disappearing.
Or end up in a whole bunch of other ones. Start a whole bunch of extra families.
Genghis Khan.
Yeah, right? Go back and undo it.
Well, so let's go to this one though. The socially constructed reality. This is where idealism went, right? So it's not like we've got this mysterious
Where did it
structure of ideas in the universe.
I mean, what was Hegel's actual view of it then? If it wasn't socially constructed, how was it constructed for him?
Well, I believe when you look at how the concepts are evolving, government evolves, by the way, he gives us a narrative. There's a story behind the history. And that is that it's moving towards more and more freedom for individuals. And by the way, the United States will be the future of this next movement, right? You know, so he's talking about the evolution of culture. But culture imposes a particular limitation on the way you view reality. So that's where Plato's ideas went to, right? And by the way, this ties into the physics that we get from Leibniz and Berkeley. Remember, I argued that Berkeley wasn't being an idealist in this abstract, weird sense.
Well, right, that everything
is actually energy,
yeah.
right? And in that sense, then they're right on track. And by the way, this leads us to Einstein, relativity, quantum mechanics, and a very nice linear historical progression, right? So I feel kind of happy with my understanding of that. That's not just completely mine. I got it from professors that I thought were absolutely outstanding. The advantage of going to a relatively small school where the professors were all top-notch, but there because they wanted the benefit of the retirement program, you know, and so it was just a few of us. We basically had this one-on-one relationship then with people that understood what was going on. I left that program, and I, of course, had a great career in the military, but meanwhile I start meeting other people in philosophy and discover that, you know, they didn't luck out. They didn't have those kinds of professors as far as they were concerned. Kant was the top, you know, deal, and follow the analytic tradition.
Right.
And they missed out on what Europe continued to do. And in fact, look at Europe as kind of mystified. Whoa, what the heck are they talking about? You are and you aren't. How can you do that, right? You know, you either are or you aren't, not both. You know, that's, you know, the nature of the exclusive or, right? You know, you can't be both, right? Whereas the Europeans are using the inclusive or, you know, because of course you have to interpret it in multiple contexts. That makes absolute sense to me. I'm not puzzled at all. I can listen to someone like Slavoj Žižek, who is clearly a Hegelian.
Žižek cracks me up. Have you seen him and Stephen Kotkin talk about Stalin?
Oh, he loves Stalin. That's,
I know.
You know, the poster, as soon as you come into his apartment, is a big poster of Stalin.
Oh, you've been in his apartment?
No, but you can see it in videos.
No, but like...
In a sense, yes. I've been in his apartment. Yeah.
But no. No, Stephen Kotkin is like the, I think he's like the Princeton professor of history, and he's working on this like giant 3-volume piece on Stalin. And they sat down and did like a huge talk at New York Public Library. Zizek's just got such an interesting speech impediment.
I can't think of the linguist. Noam Chomsky. Let me do this, because this should be able to take me right to the spot. Oh, that's Noam.
One of our previous conversations, you mentioned that theory is not really of an interest to you.
I want.
Academy, Chomsky, and so on. Well, with all deep respect that I do have for Chomsky, my first point is that Chomsky, who always emphasizes how one has to be empirical, accurate, not just some crazy Lacanian speculations and so on. Well, I don't think I know a guy who was so often empirically wrong. In his descriptions, in his whatever. Let's look, I remember when he defended this demonization of Khmer Rouge. And he wrote a couple of texts claiming, no, this is Western propaganda, Khmer Rouge are not as horrible as that. And when later he was compelled to admit that Khmer Rouge were not the nicest guys in this universe and so on, his defense was quite shocking for me. It was that, no, with the data that we had at that point, I was right. At that point, we didn't yet know enough, so, you know, But I totally reject this line of reasoning. For example, concerning Stalinism, the point is not that you have to know, you have to photo evidence of Gulag or whatever. My God, you just have to listen to the public discourse of Stalinism, of Khmer Rouge, to get it that something terrifyingly pathological is going on there. For example, Khmer Rouge, even if we have no data about their prisons and so on, isn't it, in a perverse way, almost fascinating to have a regime which, in the first 2 years, 75 to 77, behaved towards itself, treated itself as illegal. You know, the regime was nameless. It was called ANCCA, organization, not Communist Party of Korea, organization. Leaders were nameless. If you asked, who is my leader, your head was chopped off immediately, and so on.
So just Noam Chomsky, an extreme liberal, of course, but he's also looking at things from the Kantian analytic point of view. Whereas Zizek in his, so for Noam, Zizek is ridiculous, makes no sense.
Right.
No point in listening to them. Roger Scruton says the same thing about a lot of the Europeans, and that's kind of concerning to me because he's pretty right on in a lot of contexts.
Because I like Zizek. I think he's good.
Yeah. But the thing is, if you understand the trajectory of the European tradition through Lacan, through Zizek, through Alain Badiou, they all talk that way. Of course, students that go to the various universities all learn to talk that way. Mm-hmm. And if you read enough of it, you can learn to follow what's going on with that. And you have to be accepting of the Kantian, or not the Kantian, but the Hegelian antithesis, synthesis, the idea that these